Good afternoon, everyone. Just a few practical information before we let Robert speak. Ivo will first introduce the journal and the lecture, just explain the concept and why we have been holding those over the years. I will then briefly introduce Robert himself. He will speak then for about 40 minutes. And we will then have some time for question and discussions. We'll then aim to finish up about 5:15 because our publisher is treating us to a small drinks reception just on the corner there where you're all invited to join us. So that's it. Welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome also from my side. I'm the editor of the International Journal together with my co-editor, Estelle. We would also like to thank for the practical organization of this. Thanks to Gemma and Anoya. Thanks also to our publisher for being here and for supporting us so nicely. And it's also very pleasant to see that a number of members of the editorial board of our journal and the international advisory board are present here, at least at the conference. Claudia is here, but also Gemma is in the club of the international journal. Vesna, Stefan, Marikinen, Fernanda, Bruna. So we are here with a strong representation, so to say. But that means also that you can talk to them about the journal if you have some criticisms or ideas on how we can improve that enterprise. So that is for us important to receive this feedback. So the International Journal started in 2013. So we exist 10 years, we are in our 10th year. The first 5 years, the name was a little bit different. It was Restorative Justice, an international journal. But in 2018, we had to change the name of our journal into the International Journal of Restorative Justice, and that had everything to do with the change of the publisher and all kinds of legal implications and troubles, let's say. On that occasion. So we are an international journal, and I would like to emphasize that again. We try to address all regions, topics from all regions in the world. The international character is also reflected in the composition of our editorial board and international advisory board, I think. Is also reflected in the choice of articles, and for example also in the choice of books to be reviewed in our book review session. So we give a lot of attention also to publications that are not necessarily published in English, but also in other languages on restorative justice, and we try to get them present through our book review section as well. We also try to encourage non-English native authors to submit articles. We do quite a lot of efforts to support them also in that respect. That is important, I think, because it is a problem that the predominant language is just one language in restorative justice, English. Is that not a problem? Is that not a kind of epistemic injustice that we are facing here? So we run the risk, I think, to really exclude important sources of knowledge by just giving priority to only one language in our international work in general, I think. So we are a little bit concerned about that, and we try to offer something in that respect. We are an academic journal. We adopt high standards in order to, before we accept an article, it goes through a severe, strict review process. But also practice innovation finds a place in our journal. That is something that you see in the other section of the journal, the notes from the field section, where we really try to report on innovative, relevant developments in practice, in policy making, relevant in an international way. And that gives very often also a lot of inspiration. The participatory character of our journal is also reflected in sections as these notes from the field, where we usually also work with respondents, people who further reflect on the report of the new initiative that is taking place in a certain country. So this brings in some interaction, some participation, and that also happens in our section on conversations on restorative justice. So there we interview usually a person with interesting ideas of our experiences, be it in research, theory, or practice of restorative justice. So we have also an editorial usually, articles, notes from the field, conversations section, and then a book review section for which Fernanda is responsible, by the way. So I think that is our motivation, that support, critical support for restorative justice is needed worldwide. And therefore we try to report on findings of empirical research throughout our articles, of course, but we also give room to theoretical conceptual reflection and discussion, of course. But we also need you. We need you as readers, people who submit articles to this marvelous journal, and even also to subscribe, maybe, to the journal. And it would be so nice to see if you could convince your librarians of your universities or research institute to subscribe effectively to this journal, so that also your students and your colleagues have really effective access to this wealth of information that we offer. So enough promotion, I think. The annual lecture is an activity that we provide every year, usually linked or in the context of an international conference. So last year we had Antoine Garapon from France, for example, and his lecture, which was for good reasons online still last year, his lecture will be published in issue 2 of the journal. So in a couple of months it will be available. So I give now the microphone back to Estelle to introduce our lecturer of this year.
Thank you, Ivo. Just to let everyone know that we're actually recording this lecture, so to give the possibility for more than just you to listen to Robert today, we will stop the recording at the questions so that we can speak freely and have nothing stopping us. So it is my great honor to introduce our illustrious lecturer, Professor Dr. Robert Peacock. He's the outgoing president of the World Society of Victimology, as we all know, and the academic head of the Department of Criminology at the University of Free State, South Africa. Since the apartheid years in South Africa, he has been working actively in the field of victimology of state crime, with a particular focus on the phenomena of street children and children deprived of their liberty. As a national researcher, research foundation rated scientist, he has been playing an active role within the scientific community with a presentation of research findings at various regional and international symposia, together with interventions at the UN with special observer and delegate status. Professor Peacock is the author of several scientific publications and serves regularly on scientific committees of prestigious international symposia and editorial boards of regional and international scientific journals. He's the editor of the text Victimology in Africa, a critical emancipatory framework endorsed by Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation. Robert, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ivo, Estelle, members of the editorial board, contributors, the publishers, and all participants, of course, for this enormous honor to present here today your inaugural lecture. To me, this is only a highlight in terms of my outgoing status as president. I think one cannot hope for anything better and anything more rewarding to mark the end of an era. So the topic of my lecture is restorative justice. and access to justice, critical reflections from the global North-South divide. Now, within the global North-South divide, there's very little reason to assume that any interventions, development programs, or economic reforms can ever fully resolve the underlying causes of many victimological harms that affect the periphery or the so-called developing world, in inverted commas, unless and until it leads to greater freedom, equality, inclusivity, dignity, and justice. With reference to the inequality of victimization that continues to define the colonial, post-colonial continuum, which in my opinion is rather old Western tension between restorative justice and criminal justice as competing paradigms in dealing with conflict, seems rather remote and appears to me as a so-called first world problem, especially when one starts to focus on more fundamental concerns of the global South that is marked by the resource curse, the aftermath of colonization and its associated structural and institutional victimization that continue to this very same day to play out in multiple deprivations, recurrent indignities, elite politics, socio-political instability, and state corporate crime, also with very little access to state resources and a very meager regard for so-called disposable victim groupings, such as offenders as victims, street children, child soldiers, and so forth. So it's therefore not simply just a matter of criminal justice versus restorative justice, but rather there are areas where we need to understand justice as a whole, also in concert with prevailing power relationships. Or if I can phrase this differently, all justice systems in the post-colonial states must be decolonized. To demonstrate such a statement, the continued and pervasive nature of the victimology of state crime in Africa alone, 34 countries criminalize private consensual sexual activities between adults of the same sex, and the death penalty is also imposed for similar deeds in 5 countries. Also on the colonial, post-colonial continuum, state hate crime has been imported and perpetrated in the majority of the countries of the Commonwealth, most of them former British colonies. So the colonial context adds thus a further dimension as to how we need to understand power relationships and connections between the modern political state and the globalized nature of gross violations of human rights. Karl Marx noted the dawn of capitalist production was made possible through the exploitation of the people and resources in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. It was the enslavement and entombment in the minds of Aboriginal populations in the Americas that formed the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies and the European scramble for Africa, that laid the foundations for capitalist development built on human rights abuses of the colonized and enslaved. According to the World Inequality Report of 2022, after 3 decades of trade and globalization, global inequalities remain as pronounced today as at the time of the peak of Western imperialism. The COVID pandemic has, of course, also exacerbated global inequalities. But however, prior to this pandemic, the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development were already uneven and across countries, goals and targets, whereas Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, were less than 50% on track on the way towards meeting the best possible outcomes, and we're off track on most of the SDGs. So prior to colonization, prior to COVID, it was already a concern in terms of the global inequality. If you actually go and look at the Sustainable Development Goals, there's a recent report that was released. If you look, the pronounced feature of this in terms of all 17 Sustainable Development Goals is the issue of inequality Inequality is the disease of our time, and through this I would like to present links with the past and into the future. So within the context of transitional and restorative justice and development, the research of Blaustein shows that many development policies and practices are rooted in the colonial orientation that non-Europeans or indigenous communities and colonial subjects were considered as trapped in stifling cultural traditions. The moral devaluation of colonial subjects were fueled by the exploitation of natural resources and labour that ultimately amplified inequalities and between the colonizers and the colonies, but also within the colonies themselves. And this established long-lasting relations on the colonial, post-colonial continuum of economic dependency, reinforcing the so-called underdeveloped label. So this structural and institutional victimization were accompanied by the importation of Western legal systems with criminal justice as its agent, thinking here about colonial policing and total institutions by the colonial masters to subjugate and regulate the conduct of the colonial or the colonized subjects whilst exploiting both their land and their labour. So with historically constructed socioeconomic inequalities, a shift is required within the discourse and practice of reconciliation, with due regard to the economic and social rights and the related push to deal with those wrongs by the advantaged and superpowers, with critical concerns about culpability, responsibility and accountability. For some, holism appears to offer a way out of hard dilemmas, such as truth versus justice, peace versus justice, transitional justice versus development. But the research of Hove shows, and it highlights, that prevailing ethnocentric Western conceptualizations of development, where the so-called backwardness and traditionalism of societies are simply viewed as barriers to progress. So, to date, the policy of sustainable development fails to reconcile environmental protection and economic expansion, and may simply serve to deflect the West's overconsumption and role in causing underdevelopment, but also of other global injustices, by allowing for continued growth without real and meaningful reform. So, in order to be more meaningful, reforms of sustainable development need therefore to take into account the global north-south divide and subordination, but also to focus on the immense concentration of power and wealth in the hands of a few in order to engage in a sustainable fashion with labour, production, global markets and other social relations that perpetuate inequality. Critical scholars have demonstrated that political elites uphold their privilege, status and interest by not only by defining crimes, but also shaping criminal justice responses to it. In the Global South, the apartheid regime, I think, serves as a very good example. At the core of the massive violations of human rights lie the need for cheap and readily supply of labour to ensure the continued exploitation of the country's great mineral wealth by the white elite. Engagement, therefore, is required at multiple different levels, because what we do see in the Global South, political elites simply take over the role of the previous colonial masters. So whenever we engage into questions of access to justice, it needs to be at a multidimensional level. According to the writings of Chris Canine, who is very known for his work on Aboriginal justice in Australia, this very process of colonization, through its assimilation, exploitation, general social exclusion and criminalization, had lasting effects on present-day criminal justice. Not only were formal justice systems based on the settler colonial ideology, but its discriminatory values continue to hamper post-colonial societies, even as they move more closer now to positive decolonized forms of justice. With the state as being the greatest barrier to the well-being of all in the conflict situation, a normative hierarchy has been created of moral categories and diagnostic labels of so-called deserving and less deserving victims, good victims and bad victims, guilty and innocent victims, and subsequently cultural, legitimate or deserving victims, and other marginalized groupings whose victimization is viewed as justifiable and met with any denunciation. In this regard, I can refer you to, this might sound familiar, refer you to the work of Ezat Fatah, but also the work of Niels Christie, who referenced the so-called peer victim and idealized conceptions of innocence underpinning determination of who is and who is not recognized as a victim, and therefore presenting with benefits together with the false victim-offender dichotomy identified by Fatah. So simply put, what we have here is a situation of society supporting criminal justice responses by adhering to a hierarchy of more deserving and less deserving victims, which would be completely inexcusable in any kind of other scientific pursuit. Together with that, this false victim-offender dichotomy, already identified by Professor Fatah, actually atomizes the victim and portrays the offender as the greatest obstacle to all in the conflict situation, whereas actually the problem lies with the state. So whenever we are dealing with the many post-colonial justice practices, we see that the ways restorative justice has been introduced, developed and implemented, that there are some concerns and problems around this. I want to refer you to the work of Daly. It seems somehow that the post-colonial states tend to adopt restorative justice practices into a Western crime control model, and then claim that these practices are to aid indigenous offenders, like the ones referenced by Chris Canine and the Australian Aboriginals. This false categorization is considered, of course, very damaging and harmful, and also towards the indigenous community, but also it shows also a lack of awareness amongst policymakers and program developers about indigenous cultures and indigenous justice, and the identity and the extent of its differences to mainstream culture. So, in other words, restorative justice and indigenous justice may share some similar practices, but the way in which each justice method is executed and applied to individuals and communities may differ, and therefore indigenous justice and restorative justice cannot always be considered equal or similar due to cultural and contextual differences. In support of this premises and the mentioned relevance of culture and context, I would like to evoke here the restorative cultural values of Ubuntu that was functional in a South African and African context. Since, as Fatah has also reminded us as proponents of restorative justice, that the West often forgets that pre-industrial Africa was the cradle of restorative justice. So this context-specific orientation and cultural relevance may explain the gains made through the incorporation of restorative and humanizing values of Ubuntu in the interim constitution of the Republic of South Africa, as an example of a local context, which paved the way for the first democratic elections that relied on the very willingness of victims to recognize the humanity of the perpetrators of gross human rights violations. Without their forgiveness, there would have been no future for the new republic at the dawn of a new democratic order. And the epilogue of the interim constitution emphasized that the divided society that emerged from apartheid bore a legacy of hatred, fear, guilt, and revenge, and also the need to understand that we require reparation, not vengeance, but also not a need for retaliation, but a need for Ubuntu, but not for victimization. So Ubuntu also made its jurisprudence in the Constitutional Court of the State versus Makwanyane, where the death penalty was abolished in South Africa. In the words of Justice Langa, just to demonstrate to you exactly what this terminology means and its relevance and why it was successful within our local context as restorative values, In his words, Justice Langa says, if a culture such as Ubuntu, which places some emphasis on communality and on the interdependence of the members of the community, it recognizes a person's status as a human being, entitled to unconditional respect, dignity, value, and acceptance from members of the community that such a person happens to be part of. It entails the converse, however, also. The person has a corresponding duty to give the same respect, dignity, value, and acceptance to each member of the community. More importantly, it regulates the exercise of rights by the emphasis it lays on sharing and co-responsibility and the mutual employment of rights by all. Just to recap, what we see often is that restorative justice is implemented as indigenous justice, but there's not always the sensitivity prevalent. And therefore, it may not always be successful. In our context, it worked because Ubuntu was an indigenous cultural value. So an outstanding feature of Ubuntu is, of course, the value it places on human dignity, signifying that the life of one person is at least as valuable as that of another, and that respect for the dignity of every person is integral to this concept. So the return in South Africa to Ubuntu here as a case study addresses in this landmark case, in specific, the colonial and apartheid's lack of respect and utter disregard for the human life and dignity of groups other than those of European descent. So with the restorative values of Ubuntu that spearheaded the development of a genuinely legal, plural culture that needed to embody deep notions of inclusivity, after the atrocities of colonization and apartheid, we have seen restoring harm becoming one of the central aims of South African sentencing policy, the entire configuration of our traditional court system. And we've also found now that Ubuntu values are incorporated in administrative law, but somehow at this moment still not as welcomed yet in civil or private law, as in the case of public law. But nevertheless, it is also evident in emerging jurisprudence, showing how you can actually legitimize a system through being appropriately engagement through culture. But important, and I think usually people stop at reconciliation and dignity at this point, I would really like to emphasize the importance of the very serious challenges that still remain in addressing social and economic rights as an important dimension in the protracted struggle against inequality and the abuse of power. Within the local African context, it presented with the very potential to harmonize Western values, or so-called more individual-oriented values, with indigenous or communal values on the other hand. This should be considered, I think, a functional imperative, particularly with reference to the prolonged oppression that is usually associated with structural and institutional victimization, since it's furthermore also widely accepted today that increasing the power of the criminal justice system, and here I want to refer you to Sustainable Development Goal 16, Target 16.3, Rule of Law, where it can be counterproductive when the rule of law, when it comes to addressing the underlying structural causes of crime, inequality, and victimization. There is also the omnipresent risk that any proactive policing strategy may simply serve to target minority groups, as we've seen from the recent events in the United States. We see this with the disproportionate representation of Aboriginal youth within the Australian criminal justice system and likewise in New Zealand. So, but I think also a very good example where the rule of law result in further human rights violation would be, of course, when there are particular concerns around legitimacy of the police and criminal justice system, which is a problem not only in local global south context, but is also a challenge within the global north due to the very nature of secondary victimization. So certainly, if anything, the criminal justice system can only benefit from a renewal through restorative interventions. Recentering a post-colonial worldview and cultural context as preferential over dominant North American and Eurocentric understandings of victimization, a focus solely on Western law and criminal justice as its agent would remain very problematic and could be considered another hidden form of oppression. Motives that drive restorative justice arose in the global north from social-legal concerns and legislation that encourages the use of restorative justice, while the crisis of legitimacy and the usefulness of the very important Western criminal justice system seems to be more acute in the global south. But as I mentioned, of course, relevant elsewhere as well. In this regard, I would like to refer you in terms of, often we think about the global north in comparison to the global south as being far more sympathetic and supportive towards victims of crime. Professor Mark Groenhuizen conducted research during pre-COVID on the European Union's directive establishing minimum standards on the rights, support and protection of victims of crime. And his research showed very clearly that victim support systems and access to justice fall short for all types of victims among all member states in the EU. So I think that is very important when we look at the plight of victim, that we actually also understand it more from a global perspective. So liberty is very seldom found in law only, and paper rights may serve chiefly to mask the hegemony of disenfranchised groups who are participating in mechanisms of their own oppression. So with any discussions on victimology, restorative justice and transitional justice, it remains therefore very crucial to be sensitive to the struggle of vulnerable groups in society and to be mindful that the greatest threat to rights and access to justice is often from the state itself. We know the widespread role of state institutions often sanctioned by law as the perpetrators of some of the greatest crimes against humanity, including the lamentable crimes of slavery, genocide and ecocide. With the protracted liberation struggle waged against the colonial masters achieving legal and constitutional gains, one always needs to remain mindful of the nexus of law and criminal justice with the historical, political, cultural and economic spheres in society, thereby engaging beyond very narrow constitutional and legal. Shall I say this again? All right, I think she's okay. So with any protracted struggle against the colonial masters and the aftermath of colonization, achieving legal and constitutional gains, as was the case with South Africa, we still nevertheless need to remain mindful of the nexus of the law with the historical, the economic and the cultural and political dimensions and spheres in society. Otherwise, we are not going to engage beyond very narrow constitutional and legal frameworks in pursuit of both the people's-oriented victimology and the decolonization of justice project. With reference to the Latin American criminal justice systems in particular, the central countries, the selective, inadequate and stigmatizing dysfunctional nature of the criminal justice system excludes and marginalizes, likewise as in Africa and other parts of the global south, marginalizes the most social and economic vulnerable in society and is closely connected also to the crisis of legitimacy with its very reactive mass deprivation of liberty as principal response to conflict. So we have seen a treaty warns also of a complicity of net widening of restorative justice, that the same errors of alternative penalties are not to be repeated, contributing henceforth to an inability to really reduce effectively prison sentence. In other words, for restorative justice not to make the same mistakes through its co-option by criminal justice. As you would know as experts, Restorative justice is not a simple process. It also requires material resources, expertise, and much effort on all the participants in a problematic situation. At micro and macro level, equal access to justice implies that the materialization of rights for all in order to promote also economic and social equality in broader society, and requires from us to think structurally and to understand the world from the margins, to direct our attention to global structures, unequal exchange and inequalities embedded in the global capitalist economy that continue to polarize the post-colonial world. On March 26, 2019, the European Parliament adopted a resolution on the, and I'm quoting, the fundamental rights of people of African descent in Europe, recognizing that racism and discrimination experienced by people of African descent is structural and stems from historical repressive structural questions of colonization. So this serves as a crucial reminder that colonization was about material resources, and decolonization, therefore, cannot be accomplished here with us just through changes in epistemology and axiology alone. In other words, to engage critically with Western epistemological privilege and status through the decolonization of hegemonic constructions of indigenous victimization, criminalization, and justice, or the inadequacies to recognize incongruities between ontological understandings of the self in terms of the Western orientation, which is more individual-oriented, as opposed to the local context, which tends to be more focused on the collective. So we need to understand the world from the margins. Class struggles, uneven development, and unequal exchange globally, with the super exploitation of labor and raw materials in the periphery. Delinking requires both localizing and globalizing, and therefore does not simply imply the cutting off of all ties of the global economy, but to refrain from submitting national development strategies to the imperatives of globalization and to prioritize the needs of the people rather than acceding to the demands of international capital. The proverb, time heals all wounds, remains very questionable in the case of historical wrongs. And we have also witnessed initiatives in both the global north and the south seeking to shed light on our violent past, to make financial reparations, to return cultural property and human remains, or for former colonizing countries to express official apologies. But also the invocation of the important Western medical model of disease and healing to only obscure the structural and institutional violent legacy of colonization and state crime, and subsequently also the root causes of societal distress with diminished state accountability and reconciliation. Rather than attempting to psychologize away social inequality, racism and human rights abuses, a broader framework of access to justice and reconciliation is required to capture the complexities of distress and victimization in the global south, but also elsewhere. Instead of looking for structural and systemic solutions, the concept of resilience, which means to bounce back, a concept borrowed from engineering and appropriated from engineering, has also become a very popular catchphrase used by governments, international finance organizations, and the NGO sector, with reference to the assumed capacity of individuals and communities to deal with the distress resulting from ecological, socio-economical, and political disturbances. In other words, we may not be able to fix it, or we may not be able to stop it, but we can celebrate the resilience of communities that continue to get through it. But continuously asking indigenous and non-Western communities to be resilient in the face of land grabs, state corporate crime, and ecocide, the futilities of transgenerational, structural, and institutional victimization remains concealed and unabated. So within a critical decolonizing restorative framework, it could therefore be concluded that localized workings of privilege and power and the hierarchies that inform these relationships remain connected to the global patterns and consequences of structural victimization and subordination. Also, with the very prosecution of victims as offenders by the state and criminal justice as the agent. So to humanize the local vernacular and to advance the intense humaneness of a universal personhood, if I may quote the slain freedom fighter Steve Biko here, vigilance and interpretation of the geopolitical dimension, power relations and dynamics would remain a functional imperative of a critical restorative justice, and in particular when contesting and addressing the othering of marginalized subjects, albeit under the label of offender or under the label of victim, with implications for accountability, identity and variability across a range of geographic, historical and social settings. As importantly, the global economy is creating new variations, specialization and asymmetries that cut across nations and regions. So although there are still very poor and very rich countries, and the core and the periphery still remains despite globalization. Thank you so much.